The United Nations says we must feed the hungry. The question is, how? With food prices rocketing and stocks dwindling, the pressure is on to find an extra $750 million before hunger and social unrest take hold. The battle and the barriers of the global food crisis. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. It's said that desperate times call for desperate measures, and certainly for the millions of people around the world struggling to buy the most basic of foodstuffs, these are desperate times. As such, the United Nations gathered a number of international agencies in the Swiss capital Bern to create a specific high-level task force headed by Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon himself, aimed at tackling the growing food crisis. The UN's revealed what it calls a battle plan of emergency measures. But will they be enough? Are they really the desperate measures the world's poor are crying out for? Tessa Parry-Wingfield takes a look now at Secretary Ban's plan.
Feeding the hungry. The United Nations says the dramatic rise in food prices has turned into a challenge of global proportions. It's decided to set up a top-level task force to tackle this crisis and to put an end to the kind of social unrest that's been witnessed over the last few months. The UN Secretary-General says it must be ensured that there's food for tomorrow. The UN believes 100 million people have been pushed into poverty. Its first priority is to meet the $755 million shortfall in funding for the World Food Programme. It also wants to support local farmers. The UN is devising a $1.7 billion plan to provide seeds for the world's poorest countries so they can begin to feed themselves.
We must make every effort to support those farmers so that in the coming year we do not see even more severe food shortages. Without full funding of these emergency requirements, we risk again the specter of widespread hunger, malnutrition, and social unrest on an unprecedented scale.
At the UN meeting in Switzerland, delegates face this daunting challenge. The new task force will be made up of the heads of UN agencies and the World Bank. The aim is to provide emergency food relief and long-term solutions. The international bodies have called on countries not to restrict exports of food to secure supplies at home. The attention of the world community has no doubt been caught, but the UN says words now need to turn into action. Tessa Parry-Wingfield, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's put this global food crisis into some sort of context, the way it affects everyday people in an everyday way. Now, consider this. It is a 2-kilogram bag of rice. On average, the price of this has increased 74% from this time last year. That is according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Now, some people might be able to cope with such a price increase. Maybe they don't eat much rice. But in Bangladesh, for example, where rice is a staple part of the diet, this 2-kilogram bag of rice now accounts for half of a family's daily income. 50% of their money gone on one bag of rice. Let's bring in our guests at this point. In Rome, Abdulreza Abbasian. He is the secretary of the Intergovernmental Group on Grains at FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization. In Paris, Max Kaiser. He is an economist and a financial analyst. And finally in New York, Dev Rigveli. He is the Food Security Advisor at Action Against Hunger. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story and thank you for joining us. I'm going to go first to Rome and speak to Mr. Abdulreza there. $755 million is the target for the World Food Programme. Robert Zellick from the World Bank says, I'm quoting, the world can afford this. I'm sure most of us agree that it can. Is it going to materialise, though, and how long do you think it'll take to materialise?
Well, I think it very much depends on how countries are going to listen and how they're going to actually respond. You know, the issue of food crisis have been in the media for some time. We, in FAO, in December last year, we made a very strong recommendation. We made a strong warning. But here we are. And I think that as we saw this morning, Mr. Moon mentioned, there is a long-term issue, medium-term issue, and there is a short-term issue. The short-term issue, obviously, is now very urgent, and that is how to cope with the high prices that are really affecting a lot of poor people on a daily basis, and that needs that sort of an action. When you compare the figure to what was needed to bail out big banks and what we know about financial market and the financial crunch and the housing market here and there, it's not a big sum, and I certainly concur with the view that the world can definitely afford it.
And if that is the emergency measure which is needed, can you put a figure on it, perhaps for us, of the year-on-year figure after that? What would ideally be needed for the WFP?
Well, for the WFP, I really cannot say. The issue is that if the world agriculture can be developed, if the investment to agriculture, as we call for, and the bank is supporting that as well, actually materialize, hopefully there will not be so much need to make emergency actions like the one this year. So I think WFP would in fact agree to the fact that if the international community can respond correctly and timely, as FAO is now calling for, hopefully there will not be a need for such a big measure. On the other hand, if prices were to rise and keep getting higher and higher, obviously the food aid budgets are affected by this price rise. You need to still buy food, and if you have less money or you have the same amount of money but the price of food rises, this is a major strain. So all of this would require some, I would say, planning and definitely some strategic thinking as to how the international community is going to cope with any further food crisis should they ever arise again.
Let's go to Max Kaiser in Paris and get an economist's view on this. Is the UN going about this the right way, simply putting a number down and going, look, we need this money, we need that figure, we need it now, and then we'll sort out what we need after that?
No. There has to be a discussion about why the prices are going up. Food prices, agricultural products, are priced in dollars. The supply of global dollars has increased substantially over the past couple of years. It's averaging 14% money supply growth in the last year or so. This is what's driving the price of food higher. Now, if the UN is going to use a package of money to support food, if they're just simply going to borrow more money to support the food prices, they're actually making the situation worse because they're expanding those money supply numbers, which is actually could and probably will have the effect of driving prices even higher.
So then what would be the way to go about it, the opposite of that, effectively?
They need to talk to the central bankers around the world in the US and in the UK and other central bankers about cutting off the globe from this cheap credit and cheap money supply, which is driving this wild speculation in the price of dollar-based commodities. They need to raise interest rates. They need to curb the money supply growth. Then you'll see the price of these commodities coming down.
And you mentioned speculation. We're going to be looking at that a little bit more in depth in the second half of the show. Devrik Veli in New York. Max Kaiser mentioned there the prices, which is one issue. I guess the other side of that is the shortage of food around the world, stocks, declining stocks. How did we get to that situation in the first place where stocks declined so badly?
Well, effectively some areas have food production going down, but the unusual things this year is that the food production has reached some records, as the prices also, which is a concern in many areas. Right now, there's definitely a need. There will be definitely a need of intervention right now, food aid probably, but we definitely at Action Against Hunger encourage local purchases and using cash-based intervention as if the local conditions allowed it. Now, there's definitely a huge need to increase the local production, and that's where we should focus immediately to avoid such a crisis in the future, to invest in local agriculture. And we have to put all our energy into that for the future.
Are you happy with what you've seen, though, from the United Nations today, from what's been happening in Switzerland, this pledge for the more money? Are you confident it'll come through?
We definitely need to put more money into assisting the developing countries. There will be an emergency phase, definitely, as we saw already. There was food riots. In many cities. The problem is urban right now. There's also we need to think ahead also, and into investing into modernizing those agriculture in those countries. We can't just think about the 6 next months. We have to think about the next 10 years and 20 years for the local population in developing countries.
So on that
Unfortunately,
note,
it's the poorest part of the population affected right now.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and actually get a final word before we go to the break from Mr. Abdul Reza in Rome. Devrik Veli, they're talking about long-term stuff, and one of the other plans I saw with this UN plan was a $1.7 billion plan to provide seeds for farmers in poorer countries. Now that sounds good, but is there not also an issue where that has to be sustained locally? You have to think about things like fertilizer and energy, and we all know what energy costs are like these days.
Sure. And in fact, I agree with most of what was said. We have to consider this. The 1.7 is not new. We asked for that in the FAO Director General asked for it in December 2007 already. And the hope was that some of it would come so that the poor farmers could actually go and do some more farming, which they haven't been doing for a long time because they don't have access to seeds. And it's not just a question of seeds, by the way. It's also fertilizers and other inputs. So the point is that with 1.7, if it is invested intelligently, that the targets are done properly, it is not going to actually contribute to any sort of an inflation, as was one of your guests was mentioning, hopefully, but in fact it will actually contribute to higher local production so that the farmers in poor countries can become more self-sufficient. I think this is the big message, is that many countries, many farmers in many countries have the potential to produce more, but this potential is not met given the current constraints they're facing. So it is really to create a more of a sort of an opportunity for these farmers to do that, and this is really what we're trying to get at. And in a meeting that FAO has called for in June 2nd to 5th, we are going to look at these medium to long-term issues, because that is really the issue. The emergency issue responding now is very, very important, and that cannot really be matched by any other action. If we have really people in the urban areas not having access to food, that needs to be met. This should not really result in any sort of an inflationary pressure or any kind of a problem, but the medium-long-term issue is far more important. And I think the lessons learned from this year is, look here, this was simply a little alarm, but the real crisis can really come. And today you have high prices, but you still have the supply, and that is very important. It can happen in 2-3 years' time when you have a crisis, high prices, and you get even a much higher prices because there is simply not a supply. We don't have the production. We have to prepare for that.
Gentlemen, we are going to take a short break now, but when we return, we'll look in depth at the impediments, and there are plenty, to this UN recovery plan. Back in a moment.